Can you hear me, Stuart? Stuart? Stuart?
Can you hear me, Jim? Testing. Can you hear me, Jim?
Yes, I can. Did you hear me?
Yep. You can see the slide.
I can see the slide. How about that? Look
Yeah,
at my
you got
background.
that's a great background.
Yeah. It's another thing I just learned.
Yeah, I saw that recently as well, and early this week or last week. I'm gonna go ahead and I'm gonna stop sharing and see if I change my camera.
Yep.
Does that work better? So the whole of your screen?
Yes, I'm looking at the bowl. In fact, I'm seeing it in both, if that makes any difference. I'm seeing it in the micro and I'm seeing it in the larger one.
Well, that works for me. I realized, only because I just received 2 messages, that the governor is going on to do a press conference at 2 p.m. as well. So I might have some competition.
I don't see why. What's more important?
Yeah, we'll see.
I'm sorry, Stuart. I saw it in the small thing this morning and didn't realize it wasn't on the big screen.
Oh, do not be sorry, Sue. We're learning all new things every time we start using a new thing, like a live demonstration. We learn new things. So,
or a background.
Yeah, or a background of some cows. So we learned it now.
But it makes my hair look flat.
No, it doesn't. Looks good. I like that background.
I do too.
Yeah, it looks good.
So here, let me. So yeah, so we can. I think everything else worked fine this morning. Just get the little live demonstration to happen, and then go from there.
Once you got the sound worked out, it was good.
Yeah, I've moved to using these headphones. So yeah, and Sue, I think what we'll do, moving forward, this is at least my preference. Beth might have a different idea, but I think she'd probably agree. We found out this morning that when I pull up my chat screen to monitor the chat, everyone else's screen, it just appears as a black box.
Yeah.
If I'm sharing my screen, obviously for privacy reasons.
Yeah, I saw that.
So I think what we'll do is, if you can just, continue to monitor the chat, and if a question comes through, just unmute yourself and just, read it out to me rather than me having to look at the chat. And then, and my first preference would be that people would unmute themselves and ask me a question. But if anyone does ask me a question in the chat, I'm not going to be looking at it. So to kind of stop that, because I looked back at the recording that we made this morning, and there was a 10 minutes of it or so where the screen was, because I was sharing my screen and I pulled up the chat, couldn't see anything but a black box. So I'm going to try and avoid that this time around.
Yeah, if you want to tell them, if you'd rather, unmute yourself and ask a question. If not, save the chats maybe to the end.
Yeah.
Maybe that would avoid that also.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and let people know that. And if anything does come up in the chat to everyone, you'll be able to see it. And or if if for whatever reason
You're
doesn't.
flowing so well. I hate to interrupt you because
Well,
unless
that's okay.
you stop and say you have a question. Does anyone have a question? Then I could.
Yeah, and I do that a couple of times, so I think people can do that. But yeah, I mean, if I think I bet you Zoom is going to, not that they didn't have a lot of people using it before, but obviously a lot of people are using it now. And I thought a function, every Zoom that I've ever been on, what happens is someone shares their screen and inevitably says, "Can everybody see that?" And then someone take 10 seconds and someone will unmute themselves and say, "Yeah, we can see that." I just thought it'd be a good feature if there was a different way to do that, so that the presenter knew with certainty everyone else was seeing what they wanted them to see.
Yeah.
But it might be that, I'm going to continue unless something goes wrong. So if you can see my screen, then don't say anything. But if for whatever reason I share my screen and I say that I've done that and you can't see it, just unmute yourself. But if I don't hear anything, I'll assume everything is working correctly.
Okay.
But other than that, did you have yourself a good weekend, Sue?
Yeah, pretty good. It was staying in. I'm getting kind of lonely staying here. Me and my dog and I. My son comes and brings stuff to the porch, but he doesn't come in, so it's getting pretty lonely.
Yeah, it is like that for a lot of people.
Yeah, it is. It's okay if you have a spouse, but when you're by yourself, it gets pretty lonely after a while.
Yeah.
So at least the sun's shining today. It's not so bad when the sun shines, but it gets depressing.
Yeah, that's right.
After a while. Yeah. We'll get through this eventually. How about you? Did you have a good weekend?
We did. We've got some people remodeling our kitchen, so we try to stay out of their way as much as we can. And I helped another friend selling his house, and the real estate agent was coming to take pictures. So I spent about 7 hours painting his deck yesterday. So
oh, that's good.
yeah, so it was a nice day to do it.
Yeah, at least you got outside.
Took longer than we thought, so we were doing it until about 9:30 last night.
It wasn't nice here until almost, I'd say, 6 o'clock. Then the sun decided to come out just for a little while yesterday. So
yeah,
I'm happy to see it today.
Yep. All right, I'm going to share my screen.
Did you say the governor of Virginia was on it too today also?
Yeah, he's doing a live press conference, so I don't know what people will find more interesting, but
I enjoyed your presentation today.
Well, good. Thank you. Hopefully we'll see it again here.
I'm going to run out on the porch and grab my groceries off the porch. My son just dropped off. I'll be right back.
Yeah, you're fine.
Doesn't look like he was very successful.
You didn't get much?
No.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started in just a minute here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, if people jump on, they can just continue along with us in respect to your time. I'm going to get started here. Thank you for joining us today. My name
Thank
is
you.
Stuart Vermack. I'm the Food Safety Extension Agent with Loudoun County with Virginia Cooperative Extension. And we're going to go through some Food Safety 101 today. And okay, so just for some housekeeping things, everyone is being muted on the call, but please feel free if you have questions as I go along to just unmute yourself and stop me and ask me a question. I'm happy to answer it as we go along. There'll be time at the end for questions as well. So if you'd prefer to write it down or keep it in your head until the end, then do that. You also have the option of writing it in the chat box down below, and Sue Nail will be monitoring that. If there are pressing questions, then she'll go ahead and ask me. So you have a couple of ways of interacting today as we go along. So today we're going to look at Food Safety 101. So this is a really a high level understanding of what food safety is, not specific to any one aspect of it. In my role as the food safety agent for Loudoun County, I do a lot of work with produce farmers and operations, and I also do a lot of work with restaurants. And so we're going to speak about both of those today, as well as some at-home food safety things, and all of these are best practices that are applicable everywhere. Obviously, in light of COVID-19 that we're all currently living through, food safety is probably at the top of people's minds, even though COVID-19 is not a foodborne pathogen. It's not in any way being related to food. Personal health and hygiene, hand washing, things like that are on the top of people's minds. So it is a timely thing for us to be talking about today. So feel free to ask any questions you might have as we go along. All right. So we're going to look at a number of different things. We're going to look at what a foodborne illness is, the different hazards that can be associated with it, what some of the common pathogens we deal with are, and what can we do about that, in our daily lives, or what produce growers or regular farmers are doing, and what restaurants are doing. So foodborne illness, this is another way of saying food poisoning, is what it used to be called, but it's now referred to as a foodborne illness. And it's any disease, either infectious or toxic in nature that is caused by ingesting food, hence the name. And what's important to consider today is that this is preventable. Not completely and entirely. We can't get rid of pathogens in the environment, and we'll speak about what those are in a second, but we can do a lot to prevent the outcome of what happens. And the CDC, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, they estimate that 1 in 6 Americans get sick from contaminated food or beverages every single year. And that's a highly underreported number. And the reason for that is, if you've ever had a foodborne illness, and it didn't cause you enough grief to have to go to the hospital or see a doctor, usually people get sick, and then within a few days, they feel better and they go on with their life and they don't tell anyone about it. The 1 in 6 are those people that the medical field hears from, whether you're GP or whether it's via a hospital, or even you might be one of the 3,000 people who die each year. And that's a large number. When we consider what we're dealing with now with this COVID-19 outbreak, 3,000 people dying every single year from foodborne illnesses is a significant number of people. And so, it's an important thing for us to learn about and know about. And so some definitions, I point out outbreak here, and that's when 2 or more unrelated people become ill, having eaten the same food, and having similar symptoms. And so if you cast your mind back to the last few Thanksgivings we've had significant issues with romaine lettuce. And I've been involved in a number of the studies and looking at what's been going on, and working, speaking to Wegmans, seeing the impact that it had on those stores, and working with colleagues at Virginia Tech to figure out exactly what the reason was for all of those, for that outbreak. And so it's those outbreaks that we're considering. It's not the once-off occasion where someone feels sick after a meal. It's when it's being confirmed through laboratory analysis and things of that nature. And so what causes foodborne illness? Well, there are 3 different things that can cause a foodborne illness. It's not just when you eat something and it's a pathogen that causes you to have vomiting or diarrhea or something of that nature. It could also be chemical or physical. So we're going to take a look at what those are. And so this is anything that, is chemical in nature, and that includes allergens. So if someone gets sick as a result of an allergen, that's considered a chemical hazard. When we're looking at detergents, or if someone is trying to do the right thing and spray a surface to disinfect it and they accidentally spray someone's food, that could be an example. A particularly bad example is when there was a case in which a chef had put some food out on the pass to go out at a restaurant, and the sous chef decided they want to season it. And they seasoned it with what they thought was salt and sent it out. It turns out someone had accidentally left out some toxic metal cleaner, and they had seasoned someone's food with toxic metal cleaner, and it had burnt a woman's esophagus, and she had to be rushed to the hospital. So that's a very vivid image of what chemical hazards can look like when we're talking about food. Physical hazards, these are the things that we usually can see. We usually don't see it before it's done its job on us, but these are things that we would be able to find. So if we're talking about pieces of glass or plastic wood shavings, potentially metal shavings, fingernails, jewelry. There was a case in which someone's engagement diamond had come off of their ring and ended up in someone's food, and they broke their tooth biting into it. But they did find the diamond, so I guess that's a silver lining. And then what we're going to spend much of today talking about, because the first two are relatively self-explanatory, is biological hazards. And these are broken down into 4 different categories: bacteria, viruses, parasites, and fungi. And we're going to go through and look at examples of these and how they operate and things we can do to reduce their risk. Again, if you've joined us since we started, please feel free, if you have questions along the way, to just unmute yourself and stop me and ask me questions. Otherwise, you can type them in the chat. All right, so these pathogens that we're talking about, these microorganisms, where do they come from? Well, they're found everywhere. And without these, life on Earth wouldn't exist. We need these microorganisms to do what they're doing in our soils. Some of them are beneficial. In fact, a lot of them are beneficial for things like yeast, lactic acid. Without those, we wouldn't have bread or wine or beer or pickles. And I would be sad if we didn't have all of those things. Most microorganisms cause spoilage when it relates to food. And this is not going to make you sick. We're talking about yeasts, and we're talking about spoilage microorganisms that curdle milk, for example. You might throw up as a result of drinking curdled milk because it doesn't taste very nice, but that's not what we're particularly concerned about when we're talking about this. What we're concerned about is these pathogens. And so pathogens are those microorganisms that are going to cause infection or intoxication. And if you've ever experienced this, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, even a fever at times, but you'll know it when you have it. And they're caused by bacteria or potentially other pathogens in food. Okay, and most of these can be prevented by what we do, and we'll speak about that. And a lot of that goes to proper cooking or processing of the food itself. So this is probably something that everyone is particularly aware of at the moment. The same people who are at risk for foodborne illnesses are also those who are at risk for the COVID-19 at the moment. And it's for the same reason. It's because their immune systems are not working exactly at their optimal level. And so that could be, they might be young children whose immune systems have not yet developed. It might be the elderly whose immune systems are starting to slow down and not being able to work as they should. And pregnant women tend to fall into this category as well, because obviously their bodies are doing a lot at that moment in time, and their immune system might be have less of a defense than it ordinarily would. And what it really boils down to is that it takes a smaller number of bacteria or these pathogens to make these people sick. And a healthy adult, maybe not in these categories, they might not even respond to a small amount of these pathogens. But it might be that someone in this category would have a very bad reaction to these pathogens. Okay, so how do they contaminate food? Like I've already mentioned, I do a lot of my work in the field with farmers. We're looking at food safety risks. This can happen in a lot of farming situations, but the most common is produce operations, because that produce is very, very low processed often. It's often going to be consumed raw, and so there's a higher risk for that. And so things, hopefully this picture can illustrate a little bit of all the different ways that pathogens might contaminate food in the field and during processing, during harvesting, during washing, things like that. We think about animals and the poop that they might be depositing. The bacteria and pathogens that we're concerned about are usually found in the gastrointestinal tract of these animals. And so we need to be practicing all the right things to ensure that the risk of that getting onto our produce is minimized. Okay, humans, obviously there is a lot that we bring to the equation when we get involved in food. So we're looking at how our health and hygiene practices and how we're using our tools and equipment, things like that, impact pathogens getting into food. And then obviously the environment. Okay, the soil that we use, the water that we use, the manure that we might be using, all of the ways that we're using these things are things to consider. You know, when we think about the water we're using, it is probably the highest risk. Doesn't mean it can't be used, but the highest risk water source would probably be an open source of water, like a pond or a stream, for example, and using that to overhead spray some lettuce, for example, because we can't monitor at all times what's going to be happening to that water. So you might be having a pond that you're using to irrigate your field with, and a flock of geese have decided to take up space in that, and they're pooping into that water, and you're spraying that right on your lettuce, and then you're harvesting it, and hopefully not, but people could be eating it. So these are all things that we need to consider. When we're looking at on the sort of post-harvest side, once it's being delivered to the consumer, whether you might have picked it up from the grocery store or a farmer's market, or you're at a restaurant, things of that nature, then we need to be thinking about how that happens in the kitchen. And so we'll speak about cross-contamination, meaning that a piece of equipment or someone's hands or something has been contaminated by things such as raw meat, for example. Obviously, improper preparation of food, so it's not being cooked to the right temperatures to kill any pathogens, is something to consider. And then again, we look at us, and we look at personal hygiene, looking at the practices that we do. Here you have a gentleman who is coughing or sneezing right onto someone's lettuce that they're about to eat. Not something that we like to see. You know, as you've probably been aware, foodborne pathogens, they're invisible to us for a number of different senses. We can't see them. They're completely microscopic. We can't smell them. We can't taste them. They have no adverse effect to the food itself. So very difficult to know. And so we have to ensure that we're just doing these best practices. So these are a bit more of a breakdown of those statistics. 48 million people, or at least 48 million cases of people getting sick from this each year. And 128,000 people are hospitalized from this each and every year. So most foods support the growth of bacteria. We'll find out in a little bit more detail what they really need to survive. But there are certain foods that are more at risk than others. I mention often that this is my favorite slide and illustration, and I'll jump into exactly why that is later. But we're looking at how this bacteria grows. A note that I thought was interesting, that when I thought about it of putting in here, the whole concept of something being 99% clean or even 99.9% clean, just considering for a moment, if you had a tomato with a million E. coli 0157H7 count, which is a potential very it's a pathogen of concern that we'll see in a little bit. This is usually what's found in a poop sample. Is that level of a million of these. If you reduce that by 99%, you'd still be left with 10,000 of these, and the infectious dose is usually only around 100. So you're looking at a lot more than you would need to get someone sick. So obviously with this, we're looking at mitigation. The best offense is a good defense. And so all of these practices that I've spoken about, where we're trying to prevent it from occurring in the first place, is what we're doing. Our food system is definitely moving to a proactive approach to this. And next week, I'll likely be doing a presentation on the produce safety rule, which is new legislation that farms are required to do to ensure that people are safe. But important for us to be able to keep foods at the right temperatures and to cook foods to the right temperatures to further mitigate that risk. If you have any questions so far, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away on anything that I've covered. What we're going to look at now is some of the most common foodborne pathogens. This is not intended to be a microbiology training or presentation in any way, but I do just want to highlight some of the most common things that we see. And before doing that, it's important to understand what this disease triangle is. And these are essentially the conditions that need to happen in order for the perfect storm to happen, for someone to get sick. And so you need a susceptible host, right? And so when we're talking about the host for their pathogen, we're talking about pathogen growth. So we're not talking about us who might ingest the food. We're talking about the food itself. And as we'll see in a second, there are certain foods that are riskier than others, okay? Then you need a suitable environment. We're going to look at the conditions that a pathogen needs to grow and reproduce. And then obviously you need the pathogen itself. Now we can't take the pathogen away. They exist in the environment, but we can certainly do certain things to reduce the chance of disease. All right, so looking at bacteria, these are those single-celled microscopic organisms. They can grow in many food products, and we're going to look at some of these cases. So you're probably all familiar with Salmonella. 1.2 million cases every single year that we deal with. There are 450 deaths estimated by the CDC for this. And the infectious dose, if you look at the bottom there, it can be as few as 15 to 20 cells. So that's, it's a very small number of cells that can get someone sick. Right, when we're looking at E. coli, it's important to note that not all E. coli are harmful. In fact, most E. coli are not harmful. But what we're particularly concerned about is the 0157 and the non-0157. There are different strands of E. coli that get a lot of people sick each year. When we think about the Romaine outbreak that happened, that was an 0157 strain that they found. Wanted to point out Clostridium Botulinum. I'll speak about this in a little bit, but Clostridium Botulinum is often associated with home canned products. And the reason for this is that Clostridium is one of those strange pathogens that can grow in an environment that doesn't have any oxygen. We'll find out in a minute that most pathogens need oxygen to grow. Clostridium is not one of those and actually only grows in an environment without it. Particularly concerning about the toxin that it creates is that it's the most toxic substance known to man. And if you consume something with a lot of this toxin that's created by these spores, it can and has killed people very quickly. And so we'll speak about how we try and reduce that risk. Then we look at viruses. Viruses are not pathogens. They're not capable of growth on food products, which is a good thing. But they are by far the most responsible for foodborne illnesses at 2/3 of all of those illnesses. And all of those, not all of those, but a large majority is due to this little guy here, which is Norovirus. Okay, Norovirus sickens nearly 5.5 million people every single year. That is a lot of people. And again, those are only the cases that we know about and are reported. Oftentimes people will get Norovirus, it'll pass through them within 24 hours and they'll go back to their normal lives. So it's likely much more than this. It unfortunately results in 149 deaths every single year. And it's associated with anything that humans can touch. And oftentimes it's found in water, and it's a pain, this one. There are many others, but I don't have time to explain all of them that we know about. Then the last one I'll speak about is parasites. Not very common. Probably the most common is Giardia, and there are 76,000 cases a year. That is a lot. It doesn't usually result in death, but it's usually associated with contaminated water. So people might be drinking from unclean surfaces of water. We're going to move into now some factors that affect the growth. Okay, so we know where they come from, we know what they are. Let's figure out what factors impact their growth, and then therefore what we can do to put some hurdles in front of them to slow their growth down. So commonly known as fat tom, these are the conditions that bacteria need to grow. Okay, they need all of these, and so if we can make it difficult for them, they're going to have a tougher time growing. We've already spoken about how all bacteria needs food, just like us. They need those carbohydrates, they need those sugars to move on and grow. And so there are certain foods, like I've mentioned, that are riskier than others, that are more likely to grow bacteria. And these are time and temperature controlled for safety foods. Okay, probably the ones on this list are not a surprise to you. You would probably all think of having to put these in the fridge. And that's because bacteria really like these and they can grow very quickly given the right conditions. The ones on this screen might be a surprise to some. And so if anyone is game and would like to unmute themselves and explain to me what the issue might be with a baked potato wrapped in foil, or maybe sprouts, or maybe something that's in olive oil. Any ideas of why these would be foods of concern?
Does the foil on the potato create an anaerobic environment?
It does. Very good food safety knowledge, Mr. Hillary. The baked potato is a great place for Clostridium botulinum to grow because, as Jim said, once you cook a potato and it is then wrapped in foil, it is a perfect environment for a pathogen that needs no oxygen to grow, and that would be Clostridium. And so you've cooked this potato, it's really warm, it's a very moist environment as a result of the water evaporating from it. You've cooked it, you've then left it out, and you've given it a lot of time at the right temperature with the right moisture and with no oxygen to grow. Very good. Similar concept for the oil that has something added to it. For example, if you harvested some garlic and you put it in oil, that garlic could have Clostridium botulinum cells on it. If you then put that in the oil, you've now put it in a completely anaerobic environment, and you're probably going to store it in an area that is at a great temperature. And so this Clostridium that you can't see is going to be growing and multiplying and then producing a toxin that is incredibly deadly. Anyone want to take a stab at why they think sprouts might be of particular concern and why we have to control those with time and temperature? It has to do with the environment in which sprouts are grown. Sprouts are grown in a very humid environment at a particularly warm temperature. That's how those sprouts do their thing, and those seeds sprout. But it's also an amazing environment for pathogens to grow. So I'm very convinced that if I was a pathogen, I would want to find sprouts and live there. In the same way, with we're looking at that rice, that is cooked rice. If it was uncooked, it would be very safe because there's no water added to it. So it has a very low moisture level. But once you add that, you've now created a food product that pathogens can grow in. Okay, it's gonna be very difficult. If you put some pathogens with dry rice, eventually they would die because they don't have the oxygen, the moisture that they need to survive. Right, when we're looking at the cut lettuce and cantaloupe and tomato and produce, once you cut into produce, you have started the clock essentially because you have created an entryway for pathogens to get into that produce. If you have a cantaloupe, that can be left out because you haven't cut it yet. It has a natural barrier, it has its skin. But once you cut into that, you have created a natural entryway or an unnatural entryway for pathogens to get in. Any questions on those? All right, so as we've mentioned, those microorganisms need food. The second thing they need is the correct acidity level. So most bacteria grow best in a pretty neutral environment, but you know that's sort of above 4.6 on the acidity scale. And once you add too much acidity, those pathogens won't like to grow. Okay, so when we look at some of these naturally, these fruits and vegetables and even meats that have an acidity level, you can see on the left-hand side, all of these fruits and some vegetables, they're very high in acidity. And so it's particularly difficult for pathogens to grow in these environments. Now, that's not to say that they can't, because they certainly can. There have definitely been outbreaks, especially with tomatoes and things like that, where pathogens can grow. It's just easier for pathogens to grow in things like beans, asparagus, because they don't have a very high acidity. We find that if people are wanting to can produce, they need to follow strict recipes and strict processes, because a lot of the outbreaks with Clostridium are related to green beans that have been canned incorrectly. And as a result, they've essentially created a perfect environment for botulism to happen. And then they put those cans away and they want to store those for months at a time. And they open it up and they have a nice side dish that could get a lot of people sick. So temperature is something else that is really critical for bacteria to grow. In fact, all metabolic processes are most impacted by temperature. So if you think about a seed, for example, a seed is going to germinate, and those metabolic processes inside of that seed are going to be sped up the most as a result of temperature. And it's the same thing with these bacteria, because they're living things. And so there is a scale we'll look at over here on the next slide, and this is this danger zone, okay? Bacteria grow best between 40 and 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And the closer you get to the middle of that, the better and the quicker they will grow. Now, once you get higher than that 140, that's when they start to denature and they die, essentially. And that's what we do when we cook food, right? We kill those bacteria. When we go below 40 degrees, we don't kill them. We essentially are just going to slow the rate of growth. And we can, in fact, stop that. There are some that can grow at freezer temperatures, like Listeria, so it makes it a little bit more difficult. Okay, and this is where time comes into it. Time is incredibly important. And here we are at my favorite slide. And what this illustrates is just how quickly those bacteria can grow. When we're looking at a bacteria, we might start out with one, which doesn't usually happen. We usually have a lot more than one. But for argument's sake, let's say we start out with one. And given the ideal conditions that we've just described, in about 20 minutes, it will multiply. And there'll be 2 of them. And so on and so forth, right? So in 40 minutes, there'll be 4. And if you keep going along with that theory, in 4 hours, there'll be over 4,000 of them. And in 12 hours, there'll be 68 billion of these bacteria. Now, considering a lot of these pathogens, it only requires 100 or less sometimes, but even up to 1,000 to get someone sick. If you consume something that has 68 billion of these, then yeah, you're not in for a pleasant 24 or 48 hours. Okay, the other thing that, second to last thing that bacteria need is oxygen. Okay, just like us, they're living things, they need oxygen to grow. And so there are certain things that we can do. For example, we can reduce the oxygen, and that's going to do a great deal to make it very difficult for most pathogens to grow. But as we found out with Clostridium botulinum, we can't do that entirely, because then we create a great environment for Clostridium. The last thing that they need is moisture. Okay, in the same way that I described the dry rice versus the cooked rice example, these bacteria, they need moisture. And so if we look at this slide, this gives you an idea of the group and how they respond, okay? So bacteria really need a lot of moisture. So we're talking about cheeses, meats, fruits, bread, all these different things. Most of the fresh produce that we work with. Once you move down to really, really low moisture products, bacteria aren't going to be able to grow. So they're not as, that there's not that much concern, okay? Things like molds certainly can, but those aren't necessarily going to make you sick. All right, when we're looking at controlling this, think of dehydration. We think about maybe you've shot yourself a deer and you have this meat, you can't eat it all at once. You might want to freeze it. You might want to dehydrate it and make jerky out of it. That's going to be a really safe product that bacteria is going to have a hard time growing on. Well, pathogens are going to have a very hard time growing on. Okay, so when we're looking at this, if we go back a couple of slides, 0.85 below that is generally things that are going to be shelf stable. Okay, so if you look at all these things on the list that are below 0.85, all of those things are generally going to be shelf stable products that don't need to be in the fridge. So if we add all of these things together and we go back to those 16 different images that I showed you, they all have the necessary things for these bacteria to multiply very rapidly, okay? High water concentrations, moderate acidity, So what we have to do is control time and temperature, because we can't necessarily control those other things. Finally, we're going to move on to the keys to making sure that once we have done all these things that we've spoken about in terms of harvesting it correctly or it being produced correctly on a farming operation, now that you have it in your home or it's at a restaurant, what are some keys to ensuring that that food is going to be safe to handle? And essentially, it comes down to these different things. It comes down to cleaning, separating, cooking, and chilling. And you may have seen these before. We're going to go through each one of them. So first, when we're looking at cleaning, it's obviously very important that we're using clean equipment when we're cooking and preparing food. And when I say equipment, I mean everything that comes into contact with food, and most importantly, our hands. Okay. Bacteria can be found and they can get into every nook and cranny and callus that is in your hand. And so it's very important that we know how to properly clean surfaces, right? And so this brings me to cleaning and sanitizing, two completely different steps. When we're talking about the world we're living in at the moment with COVID-19, hand washing is so important. Hand sanitizer is completely secondary to hand washing, but if your hands aren't clean in the first place, then hand sanitizer is not going to be very effective. And that's because washing your hands and cleaning things, that removes organic debris and organic matter that might be on your hands, okay? And this is really important. One of my favorite quotes is from Dr. Robert Williams, who's down in the food science department on Virginia Tech, and he said you can't effectively sanitize an unclean surface. And that goes for a table or a bench, it goes for a knife, and it also goes for your hands, okay? It can't effectively be sanitized unless it is first cleaned. So importantly, when we think about what we're drying things with, if we're using dish towels or maybe in a bathroom setting there is a hand towel, if that has been used over and over and over again by a bunch of people, then you might be doing the right thing by washing your hands, but then you're recontaminating them by using that. So we recommend single-use paper towels as the best practice to reducing the chance of contamination. So as we look at proper hand washing, which is my other job title, the hand washing guy, to help people figure out how to wash their hands, you've probably likely in the last few days or last few weeks seen a huge emphasis on hand washing, which is great. I'm hoping that emphasis continues long after COVID-19 and everyone is more aware of the importance of washing their hands all year round and also particularly during flu season. But in order to illustrate this, I'm going to do a little experiment with you all. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for just a second. All right, can you all see that dish that is there? What we're going to do is we're going to have a little example of the importance of hand washing, okay? And so we have a bowl here that has water in it. And what we're going to do is we're going to put some germs into this bowl, right? Now you can see that if I get my hand and I put it in there, a lot of those germs have stuck to me, right? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to see how those germs react to a little bit of soap. So we're going to wash our hands properly, and we're going to see the impact that the soap has on these germs. So everyone watch closely as what the reaction happens with these germs. Okay, they were not happy to see that soap. And as you can see on my hands, there are no or very few germs on it. And I think it demonstrates quite succinctly the importance of having clean hands and using soap in order to get rid of those germs. I'm going to flip this over, start sharing my screen again. All right. And so proper hand washing is incredibly important all the time. And what we train people and recommend is that people would be washing their hands using an appropriate soap, and that they would scrub and wash their hands and arms for at least 20 seconds. And it's a decent period of time to be scrubbing and washing your hands and making sure that you're getting every single aspect of it. When I go to a public restroom and the person walks up next to me after using the toilet, and the water goes on for about 3 seconds and then turns off, and they walk out of there, I'm not sure what they've achieved other than wasting a little bit of water and making me feel uncomfortable. But this image here demonstrates pretty well the importance of really focusing on hand washing. It's not simply enough to put some water in your hands and go like this and it's done. It is really important to focus on all of these different areas. The dark purple represents the most frequently missed areas when people are washing their hands. And pathogens are pretty smart. They're not just going to be like, oh, well, they washed me, I'm going to jump off. They're going to find every little nook and cranny. It is amazing how pathogens can hide, even on a stainless steel bench. There are certain places that a pathogen can get into, and without soap, water cannot do anything about it because of the world of surface tension and how that works. This image is pretty good at explaining the fact that you have to scrub. It is really important. I think someone with this on their hands would arguably wash their hands much better than someone who had relatively clean hands, or at least hands that they couldn't visibly see any dirt. This person is going to scrub and scrub and scrub until their hands go back to their normal state. Whereas if we just go and use the restroom, we might not see anything on our hands, and so we might not be as focused. But it is incredibly important that we're scrubbing and scrubbing our hands, whether our hands look like this or not. Okay, and the reason that soap is so important is because of the chemical reaction that happens when we use soaps. Soaps are known as surfactants, which means that they reduce the surface tension of the water and what is on our hands, and they mix with the dirt and the organic matter, and they lift those off and carry them away when we rinse our hands. If we don't effectively wash our hands and we just use hand sanitizer, that hand sanitizer is going to target any organic matter that might be on our hands. And then it's not going to be able to do anything to the pathogens that could be there. So it's incredibly important that we're washing our hands effectively to remove these pathogens. And again, it is not a substitute for hand washing. A lot of the produce operations we work with, previously they might have just had a Don's John or a Johnny Blue, a Porta John out in the field that has a hand sanitizer in it that you just use. That is not effective at all. If someone's hands are dirty for a number of different reasons and they don't have access to soap and water to wash their hands and dry them effectively, then using hand sanitizer is not doing what people think that it is doing. So again, hopefully I have harped on enough about the importance of hand washing. And so we're going to continue that idea into utensils and surfaces. Anything that food can come into contact with, it's incredibly important that before, after, and between uses, that equipment, our hands included, are being cleaned correctly. So countertops, cutting boards, things like that. When we're looking at fruits and vegetables, it's also important that those be washed and scrubbed with some kind of device. It might just be simply running water over it. You might have a vegetable scrubber that you can get some of the dirt off, the soil off, if that is the case. And if there are any particularly damaged or bruised areas on produce, a best practice would be to remove those areas. And the reason for that is that if you have an apple, for example, it has fallen from the tree and it's hit the ground, right? Even if it is a microscopic lesion that's happened, that is a great entryway for pathogens. Dr. Robert Williams down at Tech did an experiment in which they put pathogens on a tomato that was completely intact. After a period of time, those pathogens ended up denaturing and dying because they couldn't get access to moisture, they couldn't get access to what they needed. They did the same experiment, but they made a small incision in a tomato and found that those pathogens were able to multiply very rapidly because they had an entryway to get into and get to all the resources that they needed. All right, very importantly, when we're thinking about separating, being the next step, it's important that we do that when we consider our food that's going to be consumed raw and food that needs to be cooked, right? If you're at the grocery store and you go and pick up your produce first, you might have that lettuce or tomato, whatever it is, sitting at the bottom of your shopping cart, and then you go and buy some meat, and you might put it in the little basket above it, or you put it right on top of it, and you might have some meat juices dripping right onto that lettuce. And you go home and you make a salad, you could get sick and make some other people sick as a result. You know, it's the same concept goes for fridges, and I often wonder why food safety experts were not considered when people were designing fridges, because often you'll have a fruit and vegetable tray right at the bottom of the fridge, and everything else, including raw meat, is going to be stored above that, with a great opportunity for that those juices to drip onto that produce. So we've spoken about the importance of reducing cross-contamination from people to food, from food to food, so raw meat, you know, to produce, for example, or equipment. If you use a cutting board and a knife to cut up some meat or some fish or something of that nature, and then you use that same equipment without cleaning and sanitizing it to cut up some lettuce or some produce that's going to be consumed raw. So when we're looking at people to food, I think I've made a strong enough point of the importance of personal hygiene, making sure that people are not coughing or sneezing or touching food or anything like that that is about to be consumed. Right, in the same way, you know, these meats and poultry could come into contact with that raw food that might be consumed. We don't want to see images like this on the screen with what could be raw chicken juice on that cutting board that someone is cutting tomatoes on. There could also be tomato juice, but too close for comfort. All right, so now we're looking at how do we cook these in the last little bit here. Important that anything that is poultry related, because there is that higher risk based on the particular pathogens that are found to be associated with poultry, anything poultry related gets cooked to 165 degrees, and that's internal temperature. Okay, that's not the outside of a chicken breast or something like that. That's the thickest part internally. So we know that that is safe. And it goes down depending on what you're cooking. All right, ground meats such as beef or pork or anything like that, because they're all ground up, right? A lot more surface area, a lot more opportunity for pathogens to grow all over that ground up meat. So that's 165, and then on the lower end, you've got whole cuts of everything other than poultry being cooked to 145. When we're looking at reheating and potlucks, my least favorite social activity, it's important that if we are participating in these, that we are not getting a bunch of people sick. At my church, there was a story, I think it was about 10 or 15 years ago, where there was a potluck and someone decided to reheat something not very well, and about 30 people the next day ended up very sick. So important to consider when we're taking this to large groups of people. Important to bring that food back up to a rolling boil if possible, if it's a liquid, to make sure that food is reheated to the right temperature so that those pathogens would die. Okay, slow cookers are great, but only if they're working correctly. Otherwise, you might have a bunch of meat or something else that is just sitting at a great temperature for many hours. So it's important to use a thermometer to check that that's working. And it's important to understand that different thermometers have different purposes, right? You might need a penetrating probe thermometer to test the internal temperature of meat, but you might need an air thermometer to test the temperature of a refrigerator, for example. They don't all work the same. Right, so once we've done all these different things, we've cleaned stuff, we've cooked stuff, we've separated it, it's important to chill this food. And that means that as quickly as possible, we get this cooked food into a refrigerator or a freezer so that we reduce that temperature, again, out of the temperature danger zone, below 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so that any potential pathogens that might be present has no chance to multiply. So a couple of do's and don'ts, best practices for defrosting. Ideally, you would want to do it in the refrigerator because it's going to be below 40, 41 degrees the whole time. Very safe practice. Under cold water is something else. Doing it in the microwave is less recommended, but it's still possible because you're going to be very quickly getting that to the temperature you need it to be and then hopefully cooking it. Defrosting at room temperature can be dangerous because if you forget about it, it's been sitting out for a number of hours, you could be, once it's defrosted, you could be getting into dangerous territory. And the same goes for hot water. And so that is a summary overview of food safety and the pathogens that we need to be concerned about, and what we can potentially do to reduce that risk. So with that being said, I'm interested to hear if any of you have questions. So feel free to unmute your microphone and go ahead and ask me questions, or you can type them into the chat box and Sue will let me know.
Stuart,
Yeah.
Thomas Bowles would like to know where a copy of this recording is going to be so he can share it with his master gardeners.
Very good, Thomas. We are going to be putting this recording up online. We're still figuring out the mechanism. It's likely going to be on our agroecology hub or on our unit website. I can also come and give this presentation to a group of master gardeners if you would like, Thomas. I've done that for 4-H volunteers and obviously master food volunteers, but I could also do this for master gardeners if that's something. So feel free to contact me and I'm happy to come over to Prince William and do that. But it will be up online.
Unfortunately, I'm not sure that's going to be practical in the near future.
That's very true. But yes, this presentation will be up online, and I'm happy to share the slides with you to present it.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you. Any other questions from anyone before we end this session? All right. Thank you all for your time today. With that, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to oh wait, I'm not. I've got one more slide to show you that's very important. And that is the presentations that we have coming up. So we're doing these presentations each day at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. Today was food safety. Tomorrow, Beth Sastre, our commercial horticulturalist, is going to be presenting parts of a plant. Wednesday, I'm going to be looking at food safety and biosecurity for the backyard poultry owner. Thursday, Beth will be looking at pesticide safety. And Friday, I'm looking at water quality and water safety and how water moves in the environment. So if you've enjoyed this presentation, then I thank you for stopping along, and I would hope to see you at some of the next ones. If you need the links for these, they're on our Facebook page, VCE Loudoun. Just go ahead and look at that on Facebook, and you can get the links to those. Please share this with your friends and family. We're trying to adapt to this new world of social physical distancing, and so we're presenting all of these. So thank you all for attending today. And unless there are any other questions, I'm going to go ahead and end the session.
Stuart, Alicia said thanks a lot and she learned a lot.
Great. I'm very glad to hear it. You're welcome. All right. Have a good afternoon, everyone.